The keys slipped from my fingers, clattering against the sidewalk as my stomach plummeted. Through the plate glass window of my antique shop, my life's work of 40 years, strangers were changing the locks. A young couple directed movers who were already rearranging my carefully curated colonial furniture collection. The Chippendale secretary I'd authenticated just last week was being pushed against a different wall. "Excuse me?" I called, my voice emerging thin and reedy as I pushed through the door. "There must be some mistake. This is Mercer Antiques, my shop." The woman turned, surprise flickering across her face before settling into a sympathetic smile. "Mrs. Mercer? I'm Jennifer Lawson. This is my husband, Paul. We purchased the business last week from your son, Howard." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. A cold wave washed from my scalp down to my toes, leaving numbness in its wake. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Howard has no authority to sell my business." "My name is Gladys Mercer. I'm 76 years old, and this is the story of how my son sold my antique shop behind my back and how I discovered the $1.8 million secret he'd been hiding. If you've ever had your expertise dismissed by family who should know better, subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from." Paul approached, holding out a folder. "We have all the paperwork here. The sale was finalized Tuesday. Howard said you were retiring and had authorized him to handle everything." My fingers trembled as I took the documents, the familiar letterhead of my own business swimming before my eyes. There at the bottom was what appeared to be my signature, a reasonable facsimile, but with subtle differences only I would notice. The slight hesitation in the G was missing. The final R curved upward instead of tapering. "This isn't my signature," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I never authorized this sale." Jennifer and Paul exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Mrs. Mercer," Paul said carefully, "Howard mentioned you might be confused about the arrangement. He said you'd been having some memory issues lately." Memory issues. The words landed like a physical blow. I, who could recall the provenance of every piece in my shop, who maintained ledgers accurate to the penny, who could identify the period of a furniture rix from the oxidation pattern of its hinges. "I assure you," I said, drawing myself up to my full height, "my memory is perfectly intact. This sale is fraudulent. I need you to stop what you're doing immediately while I contact my attorney." Another exchange of glances. Jennifer's expression softened with pity, the kind reserved for confused elderly women who don't understand what's happening around them. "Of course," she said in the tone one might use with a child. "Why don't you call Howard? I'm sure he can explain everything." My hands shook as I dialed Howard's number, stepping outside onto the sidewalk where I'd walked nearly every day for 4 decades. The morning sun felt suddenly harsh, exposing vulnerabilities I hadn't known existed. "Mom?" Howard answered, his voice carrying that familiar note of exaggerated patience. "I was just about to call you. Have you met the Lawsons?" "Howard," I fought to keep my voice level. "These people say you sold my shop." "My shop?" "Howard, the business I built from nothing after your father died." A sigh on the other end. "Mom, we discussed this several times. You agreed it was time to retire. The stairs are getting difficult for you, and you've been making mistakes with the inventory lately." "That's absolutely false," I said, heat rising from my chest into my face. "I've never agreed to sell, and I've certainly never signed any sales documents." "Mom," his voice took on that patronizing tone I'd heard more frequently lately. "You signed the papers last week, in my office. Don't you remember? Bernice was there. We had coffee, and those almond cookies you like." I had been to his office last week. We'd had coffee, but there had been no discussion of selling the shop. No papers to sign. Just Howard asking about a Sheraton sideboard I'd recently acquired, unusually interested in its provenance and value. "I never signed any sales documents," I repeated, my throat tightening. "Howard, what have you done?" "What needed to be done," he replied, his voice hardening slightly. "You're 76, Mom. It's time to enjoy your retirement. The Lawsons are good people. They'll take care of the shop." It wasn't yours to sell, I whispered, the magnitude of the betrayal beginning to sink in. How could you do this? We'll talk about this later, he said dismissively. I have a meeting. Why don't you go home and rest? You sound upset. The call ended before I could respond. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the shop I'd built from a single flea market stall after Harold died, leaving me with a 10-year-old son and tick 400 to my name. 40 years of expertise, of careful curation, of building a reputation that drew collectors from across the country. Gone. Sold by the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise. I made my way to my car, legs unsteady beneath me. The familiar drive home passed in a blur, my mind racing through possibilities. Howard had no legal right to sell the business. I'd never added him to the ownership documents, despite his frequent suggestions that I should simplify things by putting his name on the business. In my driveway, I sat motionless, hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see the modest home where I'd raised Howard alone, where I'd stayed up late researching colonial furniture while he slept, where I'd built a life for us through sheer determination and an eye for quality that others missed. A question began forming, unfurling slowly like a valuable scroll being carefully opened. How far would Howard go to take what wasn't his, and what else might he have taken while I wasn't looking? Inside my home, I moved with purpose despite the trembling in my limbs. The initial shock had crystallized into something sharper, a focused determination I recognized from decades of hunting elusive antique pieces. I needed evidence, addergunt, proof that the business was solely mine. My home office, once the dining room before papers and reference books claimed the space, welcomed me with familiar disorder. Shelves lined with authentication guides, folders of receipts, and decades of meticulous records. If Howard had forged my signature, what else might he have falsified? I called James Winters, my attorney for 30 years, and explained the situation in clipped sentences. This is extremely concerning, Gladys, he said, his voice grave. I'll file for an emergency injunction to halt the sale. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Bring any documentation showing your sole ownership. 3 hours later, I sat across from James in his wood-paneled office, a folder of business documents between us. The leather chair beneath me felt ice-cold against my skin despite the warmth of the thing. I've reviewed everything, James said, removing his glasses. The business is unquestionably yours alone. Howard has no legal right to sell it. Relief loosened the knot in my chest. Then we can stop this immediately. Yes, but James hesitated, discomfort evident in his expression. There's something else you should see. He slid a document across his desk, a medical evaluation with my name at the top. Where did you get this? I asked, scanning the contents with growing horror. Howard submitted it with the sales documents. It's a competency evaluation from Dr. Reynolds, suggesting you're experiencing cognitive decline and are unable to manage your business affairs. My chest tightened like a vice, each breath becoming shallow and insufficient. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the ambient sounds of the office. My fingers gripped the armrests to steady myself as the room seemed to tilt around me. I haven't seen Dr. Reynolds in 3 years, I managed. Howard made an appointment for a routine checkup, but I canceled it. James studied me carefully. According to this, you saw him last month. He noted significant confusion about business matters and difficulty recognizing long-term customers. That's absolutely false, I said, heat flaring in my cheeks. I can name every customer who's purchased items over $1,000 for the past decade. I authenticated a Chippendale secretary just last week that 3 other dealers had dismissed as a reproduction. James's expression shifted from concern to something harder. Gladys, I think we're looking at something more concerning than an unauthorized sale. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to deprive you of your vinux through fraudulent means. The words hung in the air between us, giving shape to the betrayal I'd felt that morning. This wasn't a misunderstanding, or a son making a well-intentioned mistake. This was calculated, planned. The appointment with Dr. Reynolds that Howard insisted I needed. I said slowly. The casual conversations about eventually retiring, the increasing frequency with which he told family friends I was getting fuse about the business. He was creating a narrative. James confirmed, building a case. But why? The question emerged as barely a whisper. What could possibly justify this? James had no answer, but the question followed me home, echoing through my mind as I unlocked my front door. In the stillness of my house, I noticed something I'd overlooked that morning. Howard had a key. He could have accessed my home anytime. A new urgency propelled me toward Howard's old bedroom, now used mainly for storage. If he'd forged documents, might he have left traces, evidence of his planning? The room remained largely unchanged. Since Howard had moved out 30 years ago, trophies still lined the shelves. Faded posters clung to the walls. I'd preserved it like a museum to his childhood, a sentimental relic I now questioned. I began a methodical search, starting with the closet, behind boxes of Howard's high school memorabilia. My fingers found something unexpected, a stack of ledgers identical to those I kept for the business. But these had never seen my shop. Carrying them to the kitchen table, I spread them open beside my official business records. The familiar columns of inventory, sales, and expenses were there, but with subtle, critical differences. Where my books showed modest but consistent profits, these shadow ledgers revealed significantly higher earnings and regular transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled as I traced the entries, the pattern becoming undeniable. A strange heat rushed from my stomach into my chest and face as the implications became clear. My vision, which had been blurry with exhaustion and shock, suddenly sharpened with crystalline clarity. I could see every number, every discrepancy, every carefully disguised transfer with perfect focus. I reached for the phone and called Michael Harmon, a forensic accountant who had helped authenticate financial documents for a fraud case involving counterfeit colonial furniture last year. Mrs. Mercer, he answered warmly. What can I help you with? Found another financial forgery? Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. But not in antiques this time. I need your expertise with some business records. 2 hours later, Michael sat at my kitchen table, his expression growing increasingly grave as he compared the ledgers. Based on my preliminary review, he said finally, it appears someone has been systematically diverting funds from your business for years. These transfers disguised as vendor payments. They're going to shell companies. Shell companies, I repeated, the term familiar from a fraud seminar I'd attended. Yes, companies that exist on paper but don't provide actual goods or services. They're often used to hide money. He pointed to a recurring recipient, colonial heritage suppliers. Have you ever pierced from them? I shook my head. Never. I know every supplier I've used for 40 years. Michael continued analyzing the records, his expertise confirming what my instincts had already told me. When he looked up, his expression was somber. Mrs. Mercer, based on these records, approximately $1.8 million has been diverted from your business over the past 12 years. The figure struck me like a physical blow. $1.8 million, I whispered, all while Howard told me business was just breaking even, and I should consider selling. All while he discouraged me from computerizing the bookkeeping system. Given your business's annual profit of around $68,000, that represents 26 years of profit, I finished automatically. More than half my career's earnings. Michael looked impressed. Exactly. Mrs. Mercer, if you don't mind my saying, you don't sound like someone with cognitive difficulties. No, Mr. Harmon. My only cognitive difficulty was believing my son respected me. After Michael left with copies of the records, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The evidence of Howard's betrayal spread before me. Each entry in his shadow ledger was a theft, not just of money, but of dates of major withdrawals flashed before me. His 40th birthday when he'd bought the vacation home in Vermont, claiming it was from smart investments. The year Pauline started college at that expensive private university. The luxury car purchased the same month I'd worried aloud about replacing the shop's heating system. For 12 years, I'd believed we were just getting by, carefully reinvesting modest profits, when in reality, the business had been thriving, but the fruits of that success had been systematically diverted. The most painful realization wasn't the theft itself, but the planning it represented. This wasn't opportunistic or impulsive. This was calculated, sustained deception by the person I'd sacrificed everything to raise, to toil for, to give a better life than I'd had. As darkness fell outside my kitchen window, a new question formed, replacing the confusion of the morning. How does one confront a betrayal? 12 years and $1.8 million in the making. That night, sleep eluded me. I sat in my reading chair by the window, watching darkness give way to dawn. The ledgers spread across my lap like a map of betrayal. As the first light touched the eastern sky, something shifted inside me, a clarity emerging from the fog of hurt and confusion. I'd spent decades training my eye to distinguish genuine antiques from clever reproductions. I could identify a fake Chippendale by the machine-cut dovetails hidden beneath layers of artificially aged finish. I could spot a reproduction Windsor chair by the too perfect symmetry of its hand-turned spindles. Why, then, had I failed to see the counterfeit relationship with my own son? With the morning light strengthening, I moved to my desk and began a methodical investigation, the same approach I'd used to authenticate countless pieces over my career. I pulled out bank statements, tax returns, property records. If Howard had been diverting $1.8 million, the money had gone somewhere. 3 hours later, surrounded by papers and armed with information from online property records, I had my answer. Colonial Heritage Holdings, a name eerily similar to the fake supplier in Howard's shadow ledgers, owned Eving's commercial properties and 4 residential buildings across the county. The company had been formed 12 years ago, with Howard Mercer listed as the sole proprietor. My son hadn't just stolen my money, he'd built an entire real estate empire with it. The phone rang, startling me from my research. James Winters, my attorney. Gladys, I've filed the emergency injunction. The judge has temporarily halted the sale pending a hearing next week. Relief washed through me, but it was tempered by my morning's discoveries. Thank you, James. There's more you should know. I've found evidence that Howard has embezzled approximately $1.8 million from the business over the past 12 years. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. That changes things significantly. This moves beyond civil fraud into potential criminal territory. I know, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I've documented everything: the false medical evaluation, the forged signature, the systematic embezzlement, and the real receipt purchased with stolen funds. Gladys, James said carefully, I need to ask, what do you want to happen here? These are serious allegations against your son. The question hung in the air. What did I want? The maternal instinct to protect Howard, even now, rose briefly in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by something cooler and more powerful: self-right. I want justice, James. I want my business back. I want the money he stole returned. And I want Howard to face consequences for what he's done. This may require specialized legal expertise, James said. I'd like to bring in Patricia Goldstein. She specializes in elder financial abuse cases. Elder financial abuse. The term landed with surprising weight. I'd never thought of myself as elderly. Certainly not as vulnerable. I was Gladys Mercer, the woman who'd built a renowned antique business from nothing, who could spot a fake federal period secretary from across a crowded auction house. Yet, Howard had seen vulnerability where I'd seen only strength. He'd exploited the trust between mother and son, counting on my maternal blindness to his faults. Yes, I agreed. Set up a meeting as soon as possible. That afternoon, I drove past Howard's house, a sprawling colonial revival I'd always assumed he'd purchased through his financial planning business. Now I recognized it as one of the properties owned by Colonial Heritage Holdings, purchased with my money, built on my expertise. I didn't stop. Not yet. I needed more than evidence. I needed understanding. At home, I returned to Howard's old bedroom, seeing it now not with sentimental eyes but with the sharp focus of an investigator. The trophies I'd dusted for decades, the memorabilia I'd preserved, the shrine to a childhood that had somehow produced a man capable of systematic betrayal. In the back of his closet, behind the financial records, I found a box I'd never seen before. Inside were photographs, old ones from Howard's high school and college years. Howard with friends I recognized, at places I remembered. But there was something odd about these particular photos. In many of them I had been cropped out, leaving awkward empty spaces where I should have been standing. A memory surfaced. Howard at 17, embarrassed by my occupation. "Mom, do you have to wear that Mercer Antiques shirt to my game?" The way he'd introduced me to his friends' parents as working in retail rather than owning my own business. Beneath the photos lay a college essay, yellowed with age. The prompt at the top describes someone who has overcome significant challenges. Howard had written about himself, how he'd sets despite being raised by a single mother, obsessed with her struggling business, how he'd essentially raised himself while mom chased worthless old furniture around the country. A strange heat rushed from my chest into my neck and face as I read his words. My vision seemed to sharpen, the dim room suddenly coming into crystal clarity. I could see the dust motes dancing in the beam of afternoon light, the texture of the paper's edge, the faded ink of my son's handwriting. For 40 years, I'd believed Howard was proud of what I'd built, if somewhat disinterested in antiques themselves. I'd attributed his dismissive comments about the business to simple difference in passion. I'd interpreted his eye-rolling when I discussed authentication techniques as good-natured teasing. The reality was far different. The essay revealed not just teenage rebellion, but a narrative Howard had constructed and maintained into adulthood, a story where his success came despite me. Not because of the stable home and education my business had provided. The photographs, the essay, the financial records, they formed a pattern as clear as the distinctive dovetail joints on a genuine 18th century chest. Howard hadn't just stolen money, he'd been systematically erasing my contribution to his life, rewriting our history to cast himself as the self-made success and me as the struggling, obsessed mother who needed his help. The sale of my shop wasn't just financial theft, it was the culmination of a narrative decades in the making. I gathered the evidence, financial records, photographs, the essay, and added them to my growing file. As I closed the box, my fingers brushed against something else, a small, leather-bound journal I recognized immediately. My business diary from the year after Harold died, when I was building the shop from nothing. I opened it with trembling hands, finding the entry from the day I'd made my first significant sale, a Sheraton side table I'd discovered at an estate sale, purchased for $50. Today, I sold the Sheraton piece, I'd written. The profit will cover Howard's school clothes and the next 3 months of rent for the shop space. He was so proud when I showed she the money, saying, "We're rich, Mom." I explained that we weren't rich yet, but someday, if I worked hard enough, I could build something that would give him opportunities I never had. That's all that matters, giving my boy a better life than mine. Tears blurred my vision as I closed the journal. A young widow who'd written those words, so determined, so focused on her son's future, could never have imagined that the boy who'd exclaimed, "We're rich," would one day steal the business she'd built for him. I placed the journal with my evidence file, a record of who I had been and what I had built. As I did, the grief that had been building since morning crystallized into something else, a clear, cold certainty about what needed to be done. For decades, I'd defined my success through Howard. Every sacrifice justified if it gave him advantages, every achievement measured by how it benefited him. I had been a mother first, a businesswoman second. Now, at 76, I needed to become something else, an advocate for my own worth. The realization didn't arrive with pain but with clarity, sharp, clean, and undeniable. I had spent decades proving my value through sacrifice, as if I needed to earn the title of good mother by giving more, asking less, accommodating always. I gathered my evidence and called Patricia Goldstein's office to confirm our appointment for the following morning. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, a woman with silver hair and clear eyes, standing straighter than she had in years. "Enough," I said to my reflection, my voice emerging from a place I had forgotten existed, lower, steadier, resonating from my diaphragm rather than my throat. "Enough." The offices of Goldstein Legal Services occupied the top floor of a renovated Victorian in the heart of downtown, a building I'd once helped the owner authenticate and restore. Patricia Goldstein greeted me with a firm handshake and clear eyes that missed nothing, from my carefully organized evidence file to my newly straightened posture. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, gesturing me to a seat in her sunlit office, "James Winters speaks highly of your business acumen. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "As am I," I replied, placing my file on her desk. "But I'm ready to address the situation directly." For the next hour, I presented my evidence methodically: the forged signature on sales documents, the falsified medical evaluation, the shadow accounting ledgers, the property records showing Howard's real estate empire built with sullen funds. I included the college essay and cropped photographs, providing context for the decades-long pattern. Patricia took meticulous notes, asking precise questions that revealed her expertise in such cases. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression both impressed and concerned. "Mrs. Mercer, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of elder financial exploitation I've seen. The documentation you've provided is exceptional. I've spent 40 years authenticating antiques," I said, "establishing provenance, documenting condition, verifying authenticity. These are my professional skills. I've simply applied them to my personal situation." As Patricia outlined our legal strategy, I felt a shift in my physical presence. My spine, which had been curved with the weight of betrayal and shock, began to straighten vertebra by vertebra, as if remembering its proper alignment. The tremor in my hands, a recent development I'd attributed to age, but now recognized as stress, had stilled completely. I sat taller in the chair, the documents I'd meticulously organized spread before us like a roadmap to justice. My breathing deepened, each inhale filling my lungs completely for what felt like the first time in months. "With the evidence you've compiled," Patricia explained, "we have an extremely strong case. The sale can be invalidated due to fraud, and we can pursue criminal charges for the embezzlement if you choose to." "And if Howard returns the business and the money, what then?" I asked. "That would be your decision. We could still pursue legal consequences, or you could handle it as a family matter with legally binding agreements in place." I considered this carefully. For 40 years, I've built this business through honesty and fair dealing. I've authenticated thousands of antiques by knowing the difference between genuine craftsmanship and clever forgeries. "And now you've authenticated your son's true character," Patricia observed. "Yes. And like any counterfeit, once identified, it can't be seen as genuine again." The words emerged with a certainty that surprised me. "I want my business back, every penny he stole, and I want legal safeguards that ensure he can never do this again." "Then, that's exactly what we'll pursue," Patricia said, her tone matching my resolve. "Would you prefer to confront Howard with this evidence before we file legal proceedings?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want to see his face when he realizes that the mother he dismissed as incompetent has dismantled his entire scheme." The decision crystallized with surprising clarity. For decades, I'd accommodated Howard's dismissive attitude toward my business acumen, his eye rolling when I discussed authentication techniques, his patronizing explanations of basic business concepts I'd mastered before he was born. I'd interpreted his behavior as simple disinterest, never suspecting it was a deliberate strategy to undermine my confidence while he systematically stole from me. The familiar warmth of maternal accommodation, the instinct to protect him even now, rose briefly in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by something cooler and more powerful: self-respect. I had built this business twice, first after Harold died, leaving me with a 10-year-old son, and $400 to my name, and now I would build it again, after Howard's betrayal. But this time, I would protect it even from family. After leaving Patricia's office, I drove to the bank where I'd done business for 40 years. Martha Chen, the manager who had helped me secure my first business loan when few banks would lend to a witted woman, welcomed me into her office. "Gladys," she said warmly, "what can I do for you today?" "I need to secure my accounts," I explained, outlining Howard's actions. "I want to ensure he has no access to any of my personal or business finances." Martha's expression hardened as I spoke. She'd known me for decades, had watched me build my business from nothing. "We'll take care of this immediately," she assured me. "And Gladys, I'm so sorry. If there's anything else the bank can do." "There is," I said. "I'll need a business loan to restart operations once I regain control of my shop. The inventory is still mine, but I'll need operating capital." Martha nodded, no hint of hesitation in her expression. "Based on your business history and credit, that won't be a problem. We'll have everything ready when you need it." The confidence in her voice, the complete absence of doubt about my competence, stood in stark contrast to Howard's dismissive attitude. Here was a banking professional who had seen my business acumen in action for decades and never questioned it. My next stop was the shop itself. I didn't go inside, not yet, but parked across the street, studying the building I'd occupied for 40 years. Through the windows, I could see the Lawsons rearranging my carefully curated collection, placing colonial pieces next to Victorian ones with no regard for period or style. My practiced eye noted a valuable Hepplewhite secretary pushed into a corner where the afternoon sun would damage its finish. They were good people caught in Howard's scheme, but they didn't know antiques. They didn't have the knowledge I'd spent a lifetime acquiring. The business would fail under their ownership, another casualty of Howard's deception. As I watched, a familiar car pulled up. Howard's Mercedes. He entered the shop, greeting the Lawsons with the confident charm he'd always possessed. Through the window, I could see him gesturing figuratively, probably explaining away my earlier visit as the confusion of an elderly mother. I didn't confront him. Not yet. The time would come, but on my terms, with my evidence organized and my legal position secured. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. My granddaughter Pauline stood on my porch, her expression troubled. "Grandma," she said as I opened the door, "Dad told us you were confused about the shop, that you'd forgotten you agreed to sell." I studied her face, so like Howard's in structure, but with an openness he had lost somewhere along the way. "Do I seem confused to you, Pauline?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, you seem like you always do. That's why I came. Something doesn't feel right about all this." I invited her in, offering tea as I had hundreds of times before. At the kitchen table, I considered how much to share with her. She was 25, an adult, but still Howard's daughter. "Your father sold my business without my knowledge or consent," I said finally. "He forged my signature and falsified medical records claiming I'm incompetent." Pauline's eyes widened. That's illegal." "Yes," I agreed. "It is, and there's more, but I won't put you in the middle of it. I just want you to know that I'm not confused. I'm not incompetent, and I'm going to fight for what's mine." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I believe you, Grandma, and I think I've suspected something wasn't right for a while. The way Dad talks about the shop when you're not around, like it's a burden he's managing for you, not something amazing you built yourself." Her words confirmed what the evidence had already told me. Howard's narrative about my business, about my competence, had been consistent and deliberate. He'd been laying groundwork for years. After Pauline left, I returned to my evidence file, adding notes from our conversation. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation with Howard, the moment when the narrative he'd constructed would finally collapse. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection again, the same silver-haired woman I'd seen yesterday, but with a subtle difference. The shoulders that had begun to stoop were now squared. The hands that had trembled were now steady. The eyes that had questioned were now certain. At 76, I was discovering a new version of myself. Not just a mother, not just a businesswoman, but an advocate for my own worth. The woman who had built a business from nothing was now rebuilding herself with the same determination. Howard had underestimated me, dismissing decades of business acumen as luck or insignificant. Tomorrow he would discover his mistake. The skills I'd honed authenticating antiques, the attention to detail, the pattern recognition, the patience to uncover what lies beneath the surface, had served me well in uncovering his deception. And tomorrow, those same skills would help me reclaim what was mine. Howard's sprawling colonial revival home, purchased with my stolen money, loomed before me as I parked in the circular driveway. Patricia Goldstein, my attorney, sat beside me with our evidence neatly organized in tier briefcase. "Are you ready for this, Gladys?" she asked. I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "I've been ready for 40 years. I just didn't know it." Bernice, Howard's wife, answered the door, her smile faltering when she saw Patricia. She led us to Howard's study, where he looked up with surprise that quickly shifted to patronizing concern. "Mom," he said, rising, "are you feeling better about the shop situation?" His gaze shifted to Patricia. "I don't believe we've met." "Patricia Goldstein," she replied, elder law attorney. I stood before my son, the folder of evidence in hand. My voice emerged steady and strong, resonating from my diaphragm rather than my throat. The familiar urge to protect Howard from consequences didn't come. "You sold my business without authorization. You forged my signature. You falsified medical records claiming I'm incompetent." Howard's expression hardened. "Mom, we've been through this. You agreed to the sale. You're just confused about the detail." "I'm not confused about the $1.8 million you embezzled from my business over the past 12 years, I replied, placing the folder on his desk. "I'm not confused about the shell companies you created to hide the money. I'm not confused about the real estate empire you built with funds stolen from me." The color drained from Howard's face. Bernice stepped forward. "What is she talking about, Howard?" "She's confused," Howard insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. I removed the falsified medical evaluation. Like this evaluation from Dr. Reynolds, the one claiming I saw him last month when I haven't been to his office in 3 years. Howard's facade cracked. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The business was wasted on you, a little antique shop when it could have been so much more. I needed capital for my real estate investment." "You're 76 years old." Howard's voice rose. "You should have retired years ago. That shop was my inheritance anyway. I just took it a little early." "The shop was never your inheritance," I replied steadily. "It was my life's work, something I built from nothing after your father died." Patricia stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, we have documented evidence of forgery, fraud, falsification of medical records, and embezzlement totaling $1.8 million. These are serious criminal offenses." Howard's calculation replaced anger. "What do you want, Mom? Money? Fine. I'll give you a fair price for the shop." "This isn't a negotiation," I interrupted. "Patricia has prepared documents invalidating the fraudulent sale. You will sign them today. You will return every penny of the $1.8 million within 30 days. You will sign over the properties purchased with stolen funds. If these conditions are met, I won't press criminal charges." "You'd send your own son to prison? Your only child?" I looked at this man, the boy I had raised alone, the child I had sacrificed for, and saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time. "I raised my son to be honest, Howard. The man standing before me, the thief, the liar, I don't recognize him. The choice is yours. Make full restitution with legal oversight, or face prosecution." With cold resignation, Howard signed the documents. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "When you're alone in that shop, too old to manage it, you'll wish you'd let me handle things." "I've been handling things for 40 years, I replied. "I built a successful business while raising you alone. I think I can manage an antique shop at 7. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceedings. The sale was invalidated. The Lawsons stepped aside. Howard began returning the embezzled funds and transferring property titles. On Monday morning, I stood once again before Mercer Antiques, key in hand. Inside, I moved through the space, straightening furniture, adjusting inventory that had been rearranged without regard for period or style. Martha Chen from the bank arrived with approved loan paperwork. Though with the restitution payments coming in, you might not need it. I'll keep it as a safety net, I decided. At my age, it's good to have contingencies. At your age, Martha smiled, most people would be retiring, not rebuilding a business. Most people haven't had their business stolen by their son, I replied, but without bitterness. Later, Pauline appeared in the doorway. Dad's furious, she said, but I think you did the right thing. Your father made terrible choices, I told her gently, but that doesn't erase the good in him or my love for him. It just means there are consequences he must face. He says you've ruined him, Pauline said. No, I replied. He ruined himself. I simply refused to be ruined alongside him. That evening, Edwin, my grandson, visited briefly to check on me. I've always been proud of what you built here, he said, even when Dad acted like it was just a hobby. After locking up for the night, I stood looking at the sign above the door. Mercer Antiques. 40 years of building something genuine in a world full of counterfeits. Howard had tried to take it all, but in doing so, he'd forced me to recognize a strength I'd always possessed, but never fully acknowledged. At 76, I was starting again, not from nothing this time, but from a foundation of hard-won wisdom and clear-eyed self-respect. The most valuable thing I'd reclaimed couldn't be measured in dollars or documented in legal papers. It was the knowledge that I was, and always had been, more than enough. 6 months after reclaiming my shop, I stood behind the sales counter, examining a Federal Period Secretary desk under my magnifying glass. The distinctive dovetail joints and original brass hardware confirmed its authenticity, a piece worth at least $12,000 to the right collector. It's genuine, I told Mrs. Whitmore, a longtime customer who had brought the piece for authentication. Circa 1790, likely from a Boston workshop. I knew you'd know, she said with satisfaction. My son-in-law insisted it was a reproduction, but I told him, Gladys Mercer can spot a fake from across the room. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could authenticate centuries-old furniture with a glance, but had failed to recognize the counterfeit relationship with my own son until it was almost too late. Business had flourished since I'd reopened. Word of Howard's actions had spread through our small community, bringing both curiosity seekers and loyal customers eager to show support. I'd hired an assistant, Lily Chen, Martha's granddaughter, a history major with a keen interest in antiques, allowing me to focus on authentication and acquisition while she handled daily operations. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Whitmore left. Pauline entered, carrying a small package. Grandma, she greeted me with a hug. How are you? Busy, I replied, truthfully, in the best way. We hadn't spoken of Howard directly since the confrontation. He'd fulfilled the legal requirements, returning the embezzled funds, transferring property titles, but our relationship remained fractured. He hadn't visited the shop or my home. Our only communication came through his children or lawyers. Pauline placed the package on the counter. I found this while cleaning out Dad's storage unit. I thought you should have it. Inside was a small wooden box I recognized immediately. A jewelry box I'd given Howard for his 10th birthday, handcrafted by a local artisan. Inside lay a collection of childhood mementos, his first library card, a blue ribbon from a science fair, a Father's Day card he'd made for Harold before his death. He kept these all these years, I said softly, surprised by the evidence of sentimentality from a man who had seemed so coldly calculating. There's more, Pauline said, reaching into her bag. She withdrew a folder containing loan applications and business plans dating back 12 years, the beginning of Howard's embezzlement. I found these with the box, she explained. Dad had applied for legitimate business loans multiple times. He was rejected every time. I examined the documents, noting the increasingly desperate language in each application. The final rejection letter was dated 1 week before the first unauthorized transfer from my business accounts. He was too proud to ask for your help directly, Pauline said, too determined to prove he could succeed on his own. The revelation didn't excuse Howard's actions, but offered a glimpse into his motivation, a complicated mix of pride, desperation, and the desire to prove himself that had twisted into something destructive. Thank you for showing me these, I said, returning the papers to Pauline. It helps me understand, even if I can't condone what he did. After Pauline left, I found myself reflecting on the parallel paths Howard and I had taken. Both of us had built businesses from modest beginnings. Both of us had faced financial challenges. The difference lay in how we'd responded. I with honest work and determination. Howard with deception and theft. That evening, I hosted a small gathering at my home, a monthly meeting of the Historical Society's Authentication Committee. As we discussed upcoming exhibitions and recent acquisitions, I realized how much my life had expanded since reclaiming my business and my autonomy. Gladys, said Robert Jenkins, the Society's president, we'd like you to lead a workshop series on furniture authentication. 3 sessions, open to the public. I'd be delighted, I replied without hesitation. 6 months ago, I might have demurred, might have questioned whether anyone would be interested in what I had to share. Now, I recognized the value of my expertise without qualification. Later, as I prepared for bed, the phone rang. Howard's name appeared on the caller ID. My hand hesitated over the receiver, then picked it up. Hello, Howard, I said, my voice steady. A pause, then Mom, I didn't expect you to answer. Yet you called, I observed. Another pause. Pauline told me she gave you the box and the loan applications. Yes, I confirmed. Thank you for keeping those mementos all these years. I've been seeing someone, he said abruptly. A therapist. It was part of the plea agreement, but it's been helpful, making me see things differently. I waited, allowing him space to continue. I've been trying to understand why I did what I did, he said finally. It wasn't just about the money. I spent my whole life watching you succeed at something I couldn't even understand. You could look at a piece of furniture and see history, value, craftsmanship. I just saw old wood. You never showed any interest in learning, I pointed out, because I couldn't bear to be a beginner at something you mastered, he admitted. It was easier to dismiss it as unimportant than to acknowledge your expertise. The honesty surprised me, a glimpse of self-awareness I hadn't expected. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Howard continued. I know what I did was unforgivable. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to understand it, to be better. Thank you for telling me, I said, finding no easy platitudes to offer. I hope the therapy helps. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, absorbing the conversation. Not reconciliation, not yet. Perhaps not ever. But a small crack in the wall between us, a tiny acknowledgement of truth. The next morning, I opened the shop early, using the quiet hours to update my inventory records. At 76, I was more engaged with my business than ever, approaching it not as a burden to tone in but as a legacy to build. I'd begun documenting my authentication techniques, creating a reference guide for Lily and future apprentices. The knowledge I'd accumulated over 40 years wouldn't die with me. It would live on in those I taught, in the pieces I authenticated, in the provenance I established. At noon, Edwin arrived with his fiancée, Amanda. They'd become regular visitors, Amanda particularly interested in learning about antiques as they furnished their first home together. Grandma, Edwin said as they browsed, we have something to ask you. They wanted my help finding authentic period pieces for their wedding reception. Not expensive showpieces, but items with history and character. The request touched me deeply, not just for the acknowledgement of my expertise, but for the desire to incorporate genuine craftsmanship into their celebration. As I showed them options from my inventory, I found myself sharing stories about the craftsmen who had created these pieces, about the families who had owned them, about the history embedded in their wood and brass and fabric. "You know so much," Amanda said with genuine admiration. "How did you learn all this?" "One piece at a time," I replied. "Over 40 years of looking closely, asking questions, making mistakes, and trying again." "Like life," Edwin observed unexpectedly. "Exactly like life," I agreed, smiling at my grandson. The most valuable antiques aren't perfect. They show signs of repair, of adaptation, of having been useful and loved. Their worth comes from surviving with their essential character intact. After they left, I returned to my inventory work, the conversation lingering in my mind. At 76, I too showed signs of repair, of adaptation. The betrayal by Howard had left marks, but like a well-restored antique, I had emerged with my essential character, not just intact, but more clearly defined. The shop around me, with its carefully curated collection, its organized records, its legacy of expertise, was the external manifestation of an internal truth I now embraced fully. I was, and had always been, the genuine article.